Good morning. It's great to be with you this morning. Welcome to all of you here in this room. Welcome to those who are with us online. It's a joyful Sunday morning, and it's a great time to be together. I'm also very much looking forward to tonight. I hope to see you again tonight, as we mentioned, for our Choose Your Own Adventure classes. When you come tonight, everybody come to the auditorium, children on up, and then we'll disperse to those classes from there. And I hope to see you again for that. Glad that you're here this morning. So recently I got some news that I wasn't too excited to get. I had managed to avoid this news for a very long time, but I went to the dentist about a month ago, and yes, it's true, I have a cavity. Now, believe it or not, I had never gotten a cavity before in my life to this point. But I have officially joined the cavity club now. I had heard that there was an opening, and I have filled it. You had to get the bad jokes out right at the beginning. I do want you to know that when I do something, I don't do it halfway. So not only did the dentist find my very first ever cavity, she found 5 cavities, 5 of them, which I had the pleasure of getting filled on Thursday afternoon. I can't say I enjoyed that too much either. I was very glad that I did not try to squeeze that appointment in on Wednesday afternoon. It would have been kind of hard to preach that night with lips that I could not feel, and every time I took a drink of water, I had to change my shirt. So I was glad about Thursday being the day for that. So I've been thinking a little bit about cavities recently through experience, learning a bit about them, and cavities, of course, is a word in the dentist world, a nicer word for decay, which is not something you want to have going on in your teeth. So I was very thankful to even have this unpleasant experience of getting my cavities filled. Unpleasant as it was, I was glad that we had the chance to do that. And while it was fresh on my mind, when we had just finished that little procedure, I thought this might be a good time to ask my dentist, how do I keep this from happening again? I don't want this to be a trend in my life. So my dentist, she was walking out to the door. I said, hey, wait a second, I have a question here. Now that I got these fillings, how long does that protect me from having to go through this again? And my dentist turned around in the doorway, and in the most sobering tone I have heard in the world, she said, there is no protection. If my life had been a movie, I think it would have gotten dark and lightning would have struck in the background. And she said, there is no protection. What we did today was just fill in the holes, but the only way to keep this from happening is your own personal effort to take care of your teeth. So, last night I did a revolutionary thing before bed. After I brushed my teeth, I got out a little bit of floss, and I tried to floss my teeth, and now I'm happy to report I never have to worry about cavities ever again. Wouldn't that be nice? Of course, it's not how it works, though. When my dentist said that the only way is the way that you personally take care of your teeth, I do not think she meant just occasionally or once. And it occurs to me that maybe that's not just true for our teeth only. In fact, maybe my tales at the dentist might actually help us to think about something of a little more significance. Maybe it might even help us to take the next step that we're going to take this morning in a little passage from 1 Timothy. If you got a Bible, you can go ahead and pull that out and be turning there, 1 Timothy. And if you were here last week, you know that we spent a little bit of time in the very first small few verses of a passage from the 4th chapter of this letter. We started in verse 6 last week of 1 Timothy chapter 4, made our way down to verse 10. And those verses were all about training. Training in godliness was the theme for the day last week, which turns out to be the most important kind of training out of all of the many kinds of training that you and I are involved in our lives. Training in godliness was the thing that really lasts. It was the thing that mattered most. So today we're going to take a little step further into this great passage. As we take this next step forward, I hope that you will realize that we're really not leaving what we talked about last time behind. But really today, what we'll be hearing is a continuation of what we talked about last time as we turn our attention to a message about progress. Progress. That's going to be our key theme for today. And this second theme, progress, you might can even imagine already how it does. But this second theme, progress, relates to the first one in a really important way. So let's hear what our passage has to say as we continue in it. This is 1 Timothy chapter 4. Let's pick up right where we left off. Last time we ended in verse 10, so let's start in verse 11. There, Paul says to Timothy, command and teach these things. When he says that, just to give you a little refresher, that could refer to those few verses we looked at last time, certainly, but it also refers to the whole rest of this letter that Paul has written to young Timothy as he works to minister with the church. We believe it's in Ephesus. He's working there and ministering, and Paul says, don't forget these things I've been telling you. Command and teach these things. And then he continues, let no one despise your youth, but set the believers an example in speech and in conduct, in love, in faith, and in purity. Until I arrive, give attention to the public reading of Scripture, to exhorting, to teaching. Do not neglect the gift that is in you, which we'll talk about a little more about that next time. Do not neglect the gift that is in you, which was given to you through prophecy with the laying on of hands by the council of elders. This next part's what we're going to focus on today. Put these things into practice. Devote yourself to them so that all may see your progress. Pay close attention to yourself and to your teaching. Continue in these things, for in doing this you will save both yourself and your hearers. So think about that last part here that we've just read together. Verse 15 especially. This is a verse about progress. And what is it, first and foremost, that leads to that progress? It's the very thing that we were talking about last time. Remember last time we were talking about training in godliness. We were talking about what it means to hit the gym in our spiritual faith and development. We even looked at that word for training. The word gymnasia reminds us of putting in that effort to train and grow in our faith. Well, here in verse 15, although we've moved on to this new subject, we haven't really moved on because Paul, with a little different word but the same meaning, says that progress comes from practice. It's practice that leads to progress. The outcome of training is growth. Now, that may seem like the most obvious thing to stop and point out to you today, and especially after talking about it some the week before. I get that. But I am calling your attention to this relationship between practice and progress for a reason today. And that's because it can be easy to forget, or at least to act like progress comes from other places. It might be easier than we think to get confused about where progress in our faith really comes from. So I'll give you an example. One way I imagine Paul, one contrast I can imagine from Paul's teaching here is that we shouldn't think about growing in faith the same way we think about growing in height. Okay, so when I was in 7th grade, I had a bit of a growth spurt, pretty much to the height that I am now. Now, a small part of that growth spurt, I really worked at hard myself. And I accomplished it through the length and poofiness of my hair, and I really worked hard for that extra inch that I got. But most of that growth spurt was something that I just kind of sat back and watched as it happened. And it just so happened that when I was in 7th grade, I started growing a whole lot. I got a whole lot taller. It was, for a short period of time, made me a taller player on the basketball team, which I enjoyed. But most of it was kind of a passive thing for me. I could take credit for the extra inch, but that's about it. And other than being hungry all the time and eating a lot of Sonic brown bag cheeseburgers, I didn't do a whole lot else to make it happen. It was kind of an accident of time. It just kind of happened naturally. I got taller. But to expect that our spiritual growth will progress like that, I think Paul would say, would be a big mistake. That's not to say that God might not stretch us more or grow us more in certain seasons of our lives more than others. So I believe that he actually very much does that in our lives. But if our whole approach to spiritual progress, spiritual growth, is that of sitting back and expecting that it will just happen, if it's treated like a passive thing, something that could happen by accident, we will simply not experience the progress that we could if we make it an active thing that we pursue. If we practice diligently and devote ourselves to it with that training in godliness, we just simply can't make the progress that we could, were it not to be something we invest in. And actually, we might even find that if we don't make it that active pursuit in our lives, and it's more of a passive thing, we might actually find that it leads to cavities. Cavities in our teeth, they're like negative progress. It's like going the wrong direction. The word regression, going backwards. It's not growth, but the opposite of growth, they're decay. And whether it's in caring for your teeth or in caring for your soul, it's not just that you miss out on the opportunity to grow and make progress when you kind of take that passive outlook. It's not just that you miss out on the opportunity to advance, you may actually create the opposite problem. It may mean losing ground. Not growth, but decay. So what Paul says here is really important. He says, practice these things, devote yourselves to them so that all may see your progress. It might be motivating to flip that sentence around like flipping a coin and consider it. Don't practice these things. Don't devote yourself to it. What happens then? What will people see in your life? See, this is why it matters, I think, to stop and really consider, where does progress come from in our lives? It's important for us to remember that there's a close relationship between our training in godliness and the growth that we hope to see in us. But here's where things get really encouraging for me I mentioned at the start that I find this to be a very encouraging passage, and I'd really like to spend a little time talking about why that is. So far we've talked about how God expects us to practice our faith in order for us to grow. But what he does not expect, what Paul does not expect of Timothy, what God does not expect of us, is that we must be a finished product in order to be his children, that we must be perfected in order to make a difference. We mentioned this last time, but it's time to dwell on it some more. So our section today began like this, verse 11 and 12. Paul said to Timothy, "Don't let anybody look down on you because you're young, but set the believers an example." And he gives these 5 things: in speech, in conduct, in love, in faith, in purity. In speech, like meaning the way that you talk, not like how well you give speeches, but your manner of speaking. Is it wholesome and is it uplifting? Is it encouraging? Or is it quarrelsome, divisive, rude, vulgar, whatever else speech can be? Set an example in speech, Paul says. In conduct, like the way that you live your life, is it Christ-like? Is it full of integrity? Is it the kind of thing someone would see and know immediately, this is respectable, this is good? In love, we know what that means. In faith, we know what that means. In purity, do you have a pure heart? A holy lifestyle? One that's not polluted by the things of sin, the sinful influences of this world. Timothy is called to be an example of all of these qualities, these 5 things that are mentioned here. If you kind of put a word on these 5 words, you could probably be hard-pressed to find a better one than godliness. The same thing we were talking about last week, training in godliness. Well, Paul's telling Timothy here to have these qualities of a godly person, these things about the way you talk and the way you live, that people can see a little bit of what God is like in you. And that's what will make Timothy an example. So, what makes a person a good example of godliness? Who can be a good example? Well, it's not just people who have reached a certain age, surely. Paul's going to tell Timothy in the next chapter that you really need to pay great respect to those who are older than you, but he also tells Timothy here that he should be an example. That's expected of him, despite the fact that he is young. How young, we don't know. A good example is not just someone who's reached a certain age. A good example is not just someone who has it all figured out either. The very thing that Timothy's supposed to show them is what? Not his perfection, it's his progress. I don't think it's a coincidence that Paul tells Timothy at the start of this little section to set an example. Here's what you need to show them. And then at the end, he talks further about what you need to show them. Show them your progress. A good example is a person who can show that they're making progress toward a godly life. And in some ways, that is actually a really encouraging, exciting way to think about what it means to be an example for me. Because it's not that perfection is a prerequisite. Our examples need not be just a few who are put up on a pedestal. Whatever age or stage you might be in your life and in your walk of faith, if you are working at progressing in your faith, if you are trying to train yourself to be more godly in your life, you are setting an example for all of us. And more than just all of us, for whomever your path may cross. So let's just take the first of those qualities and think about it a little further. So set an example in speech. Who can do that? Well, if you are a person who, over time, can improve the way you talk, to where you're not putting people down so much as before, not lashing out in anger so much as before, not speaking hurtfully or crudely so much as before. It's not just the things you don't do. Maybe also you're using your words for good more often. You're learning how to be an encourager. You're maybe learning to be generous with those you disagree with. You're a little more compassionate when you correct someone else. You're a little more truthful when you feel that urge to justify yourself or make an excuse. On the one hand, James says nobody can tame the tongue. It gets us all at one point or another. But on the other hand, you can still set an example in your speech amongst the church, amongst your coworkers, amongst your family, with your spouse, with your parents. When you're making progress towards speaking like Christ would speak. A good example is a person who makes progress toward godliness. And I find that very encouraging. What that means is that every person in this room can take your starting point, and working from there, you can set a great example for us all. How many of you have had the experience of when you're around someone who might be newer to the faith and you see how hard they're working at it, it inspires you, right? Well, that very same thing, that very same principle is at play there. Sometimes you might be further along and more mature in your faith than that person, and yet they are the example to you because they are making progress and they're working at it. And whatever point we're at, that's what we're called to do. And when we do that, we can have a powerful example and influence on the people in our lives. I'll close with one story. I've always loved this story. I told it once before, I believe, about a teacher I had in school. And when I tell this story, I'm always very wary that it sounds a lot like a preacher story. I don't like that phrase very much because preachers tell all manner of stories in all different kinds of ways. But you know what I mean when I say a preacher story. Sometimes they have you might have a story that you put such a bow on it so tightly that it almost doesn't even seem real, like a real true thing. This story kind of strikes you like that, but I know the person who had this experience, and I believe it was a true thing. And it's just a story about one of those little precious moments that happens in your house, maybe for this person as a parent to his children. So as a teacher I had in school, he was thinking about the fact that, he was looking at his life and thinking, everything is kind of pressing in on me right now. I don't even feel, even though I'm a teacher, I don't really feel like I am growing in my faith like I should be. That can happen. And so one Saturday afternoon, he thought, I just need to pause. I need to start working on my own growth too. So he took a little time, sat on the couch, got out his Bible, started to read. And read there for about 15, 20 minutes, and then out of the periphery of his vision, he saw one of his children. He had several elementary-age children at the time, can't remember how old. saw one of his children kind of appear in the entryway to the living room and then disappear off and then reappear again. And then she came to the couch. She sat down beside her father right next to his leg, and she opened up her children's Bible, spread it out on her lap, started to do her best to read it too. You see what I mean when I say this is a story that really has a nice, neat bow on it? And yet, the principle behind that story rings so true with what we've talked about today. That father, that teacher, realized that even though he was in this position to teach others and be a father and set an example, he wasn't necessarily growing himself like he should, like he wanted to, making that progress. So he reinvested in it. And it just so happened to have a quick and happy resolution. But as he tried to grow, he really did become an example that someone in his own home could look to and see and say, I want to try to do that too. And of course, that little child turned out to be a pretty good example herself as well to her father. Even though she was very young in the faith, as she put into practice to make that progress, she spoke volumes to her father, maybe even more so than he had to her. That's a lovely little story that illustrates something that we can all strive for in our lives. We're not going to have a carbon copy of that little moment in the living room. But as you practice your faith with sincere intention to grow, we can count on God in his own way and in his own timing to work with that. God can work with your sincere efforts to grow. And we just do not know how God can make use of that beyond just your own growth, but in making you an example for others as well. So, put these things into practice, Paul says. Devote yourselves to them so that all may see your progress. Maybe this speaks to you today. Perhaps you can work a little bit on yourself this week. Remember where growth really comes from. And if we're just sitting back and expecting it's going to happen, well, we may be disappointed. But if we can press on and train ourselves in godliness, in time we may see great progress. And others may see it too. Maybe the challenge you bring from this is to remember what an opportunity you have, whatever stage in life you may be in, to be an example to others in speech, in life, in love, in faith, in purity. Maybe that's what you take home from this today. Maybe somebody needs to respond to the gospel today, to remember that in Christ, though we are all works in progress, imperfect as we are, through his grace, we are made to be whole, complete, as though perfect in his eyes. And maybe you'd like to experience that today through the waters of baptism. However you might be challenged to respond, we would invite you to come while we stand, while we sing.